After 185 million votes in 27 countries, Europe's Conservatives are over the moon. The EU elections have seen right-wing parties' support creep up in all corners of the continent, tilting the balance of power in the European Parliament. So, what does this election result mean for Europe and beyond? We're covering the EU election results across 2 episodes. This is the first which we dissect the results. I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrahim.
Welcome to Put Simply. In the first of 2 episodes covering the EU elections, we welcome Guglielmo Picchi, someone with a wealth of experience in European politics. Guglielmo was a former member of the Italian Parliament and the Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister. He's now the Director of International Relations at Machiavelli, an Italian think tank. He's also a senior advisor for Aroca in its public policy work in Europe. He's our guest this week, talking all things EU results here on Put Simply.
Guglielmo, welcome to Put Simply. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me on this podcast, on Put Simply. I've spent a long part of my life in politics. I was a member of the Italian Parliament, a member of the Italian government. And right now I am an analyst I'm the Director of International Affairs for the Machiavelli Center of Political and Strategic Studies. And I do some consultancy in public affairs.
Now, before we get to the results of the EU elections from last weekend, I think it's really important, particularly for our listeners outside of the EU, for them to understand what actually happened last week. So if we could ask you to put simply kind of, EU 101, talk a little bit about how the Parliament works, what is the Commission, what is the Council, etc.
Yeah, sure. Last week we voted for electing the European Parliament, which is one of the many bodies of the European Union that basically is a supranational, but not a federation. So it's not a statutory entity as any standard nation, Federation of Australia or United Kingdom or the US. So basically it has 3 bodies. One is the European Commission, which is linked to the Parliament by a confidence vote at the beginning of the legislature, and the European Commission is basically the government of the EU. Then you have the European Council, which is a place where all the head of government and head of states of the member states sits, and this is the body that basically design who should be the candidate for the European Commission, and also appoints the president of the European Council, that is basically the president, the head of state of the EU, to understand the equivalent. And then you have the European Parliament, which is an odd parliament because it has 720 members elected in all the 27 member states. But unlike any other parliament, it doesn't have the legislative initiative. So the single member of the European Parliament cannot put forward a bill because that resides on the European Commission. So the European Parliament has the power to amend any legislative initiative from the government, from the European Commission, which is very powerful, so it can amend it deeply, but cannot have its own bills put forward, which is something very odd because, as we know, every parliament usually has the legislative initiative, and it's the legislative power. So that are the 3 main bodies of European Union. One last thing to mention, the single minister or commissioners of the European Commission, so of the government body of the EU, are appointed by every single member state. So you have quite odd situation of linking the parliament with a confidence vote to the president of the European Commission, but the single commissioners are appointed independently by every single member states.
Let's get to the results of the EU elections now. It's widely reported that the EU has swung to the right after these elections. Put simply, what were the results and who were the winners and losers?
Well, the results are pretty clear. There was for sure on the right part of the political spectrum in big countries like Germany and France. Far-right parties had excellent results. Marine Le Pen had first party, almost doubling the party, the Liberals of President Macron. The same in Germany, the traditional Christian Democrats and the far-right Alternative für Deutschland scored very good results. But the reality, although there is this political shift to the right, is that the traditional majority that has always governed the EU, which is a tri-party made of the socialists, the liberals, and EPP, the European Popular Party, still retain a large majority in terms of seats in the parliament. So, although there were very resounding results for the right and the far right, these have a political implication, but not a real numerical one. So it's expected that the same majority that was ruling the European Parliament until this mandate in Parliament will stay on for the next 5 years. So there is a big political divide, a big divide between a numerical result that says that the more pro-European parties were confirmed as a majority in Parliament, and a political shift towards the right that should not be underestimated because it affects the two largest countries of the EU, being Germany and France.
I think it might be worthwhile for our listeners also, Guillermo, to maybe quickly run through some of the parties that have traditionally held a large number of MEPs within the Parliament and kind of where they stand today. Also look at maybe are there new parties that have come in and are they likely to kind of play a more active role or be kingmakers, for example, for the election of the new commissioner or the president of the Parliament?
Let's say that the traditional groups, as mentioned, who always ruled had the majority in the European Parliament, were the EPP, the moderate conservative of mildly right-wing parties like Christian Democrats Union in Germany, or Les Républicains in France, or Partito Popular in Spain. The EPP was able to maintain its votes, its MEPs. It has around a share of, I guess, 17-18% of MEPs in the European Parliament. The second group, which has significantly weakened over time, each election was less and less powerful, are the socialists, who count around 130, 135 MEPs. Those are the traditional social democrats throughout the European Union. Italian Partito Democratico, Democratic Party, the Social Democrats in Germany, all the Northern European social democratic parties, Partito Socialista Obrero in Spain, and the Socialist Party in France. The third group, which is called in name liberals, but they are very close or to what were the socialists, so it's a little bit odd definition of liberals, are made of the party of the president of France, Emmanuel Macron. It has the Free Democrats in Germany, has some Belgians and other part, and they count for around 70 MEPs. Those are likely to be the parties that will form the majority in the next European Parliament and vote for whoever is going to be the candidate of the European Commission. Right now in Brussels, all these groups are gathering, holding leadership meetings to determine the position and the tactical gaming, how to approach the next month before the plenary, to determine all the key position in the European Union that, as mentioned, is a package. So basically you have 4 positions that are the key ones, which is President of the European Commission, President of the European Council, President of the European Parliament, and the High Representative for Foreign Policy. We'll see what will happen. There are all movements. Not to be underestimated is that the EPP is looking to its right, not to replace the traditional allies of the socialists and the liberals, but to have a more stable European Parliament and to give an answer to what voters in the 2 largest democracies of the European Union have said. So the voters spoke. Some sort of having this right wind in the government of the European Union makes sense. But of course, this might clash with expectation from the liberals and the socialists. So it's going to be an interesting few weeks ahead.
In the past, many of these right-wing parties who've performed so well have been obstructive and Eurosceptic in their outlook, I suppose. However, it seems that in recent times they've been much more involved in EU politics in Brussels. Do you think they'll continue to play a constructive role and further their agenda? Or do you think they'll be pushing to undermine the EU institutions and pursue a stronger anti-EU position?
That's a very interesting question, and it's more a politological approach than real political behavior. The traditional view from who ran the EU so far is that there was a mandate for the EU to expand competencies and area of sovereignty. On the other side, the Eurosceptics said there is a well-defined subjects and areas where the European Union has to perform, and we are against of enlarging further these competencies and the sovereignty. So the real discussion is that I would say having so many successful in France, in Germany, in Italy, same in Belgium, in Spain, that will the next EU for the next 5 years would be much more concerned in doing better what it's already in its portfolio, rather than trying to expand to new areas and to subtract sovereignty to the member states. So it's not a question of being Eurosceptics, it's simply halting the push for more competencies for the EU. I think this is going to be the attitude of these parties. And as we have seen in the last phase of the current legislature, of the current parliament, towards the end of the last few months, many of the policies, very aggressive one that were imposing harsh choices to the member states, have been either repelled or mitigated. So I think this trend will continue in the next 5 years, thanks to the right wing wind that came in. Of course, there are parties that are clearly against the EU. They will continue. They were pretty clear in the past. They will stay on with the same approach in the next 5 years. I think it's fully legitimate to have those who want more integration, some others that want to revert to the process of integration. As you know, only 50% of the voters voted. Turnout was the lowest since the first European Parliament in 1979. I think that being a little bit more realistic on EU institution and pushing less on further integration will get its citizens more closer and more involved.
You mentioned that the European Parliament being unique and unlike other parliaments in some of the ways that it operates and some of the powers that it doesn't have. But I think based on that, another unique role that it plays is also, consensus, if I understand it correctly, is one of the key pillars. So you often have legislation or various things going through the parliament with high majority, but after a process of significant wheeling and dealing and horse trading and consensus building, when you put that into context of what we've seen over the weekend and more far right parties being involved in all of this consensus building process, what do you think will change? I mean, are we likely to see, certain things that are being positioned to appease some of the far right parties to ensure that that consensus is reached, or you think that that won't necessarily be a priority?
Well, for our listeners, to be clear, the consensus is needed in the European Council. So where sits all the head of governments of the EU member states. Parliament works with standard majority. The funny thing is that this parliament has limitation because you have the possibility to amend any sort of bills proposed by others, but cannot start proposing its own bills. The single MEP cannot propose. Consensus is at the European Council, where you always find someone ready to block some delicate piece of legislation, being it border control or sanction to Russia or the war in Ukraine or export of cars or duties on Chinese electric vehicles, which is the latest one. So the problem is not at European Parliament level, but is what it happens at national level. So until the last few months, there were two governments that were almost always breaking consensus, which were Hungary and Poland. Then in Poland, there was a shift in government, so Poland is not anymore a problem. But then the Slovaks voted, and you have a populist prime minister, not necessarily right wing, because technically he's a liberal. But still, now you have the Slovak Republic, who may tend to put the veto. You had elections in Holland, and it's likely that conservative government will be in place in the next weeks. So at European Council level, having also a lack of a leadership, so you don't have any more the Merkel or a strong French president who can steer the discussion. So the horse trading, as you mentioned, is going to be even bigger in the next years, and Italy may play a role. I speak of my own country for the simple fact that while every single government in power lost the European elections, the only case of large member states where the government increased actually its consensus is Italy. So far, in the case of Ukraine, Meloni already was able to wrap up a deal, including Hungary. So it's tough. It requires lots of negotiation. But at the end of the day, we have to respect all the European citizens, being the Greek, Cypriots, Irish. They have their national interest. That's how a strong EU can be built. Listen to the people and trying to find the mediation that is acceptable to everyone.
Many of the far right parties have performed strongly in France, Italy, and Germany. In fact, President Macron has called an early election. What do you think these results mean for the domestic political environment in these countries?
Well, the good thing is that in most of the country, the method is a proportional vote. So it gives the leads to basically everyone, truly represent the public opinion in the countries. Parties are more free to campaign than they are at the national level for their own parliamentary election. This brings, more, I would say, more true results than you have in domestic parliamentary elections. The reality is that 80% of legislation is being done at the EU level. So basically, what is residual for parliamentary power, domestic parliamentary power, is basically 20% of the number of laws that are being done in any 5 years period, and how you translate EU legislation in domestic laws. Having said this, of course there are consequences. I mean, it's pretty clear what happened to Macron. I mean, either he was going to resign or he had to dissolve parliament. There was not much he could do, seeing that such a debacle of his parliamentary party and group. In Germany, I mean, if you see the three parties member of the coalition of Mr. Scholz, I guess, polled slightly above 30%, while the opposition basically had the conservative bloc was around 46 or 47, something like that. So it has consequences. In France, it called elections. In Spain, it says that the opposition parties are stronger than the current government, the same in Germany. In Italy, it was a way of approving the government, because the conservative bloc that is ruling Italy had increased its consensus to almost 48% from 44, 45 that they had at the political election, at the national election. So there are consequences. If they are positive, you make stronger, you strengthen the ruling party. If they are bad, either you ignore the results, saying, those are are European elections, so I mean it's another story. So you tend to ignore them. Or if they are really bad, as in France, you call new elections, national legislative elections, and we'll see what will happen in those elections. As said, the result could always be different, because in the European election there is a proportional vote. And when you have a proportional vote, you have more parties, less blocs, less coalitions, and so the outcome can usually be very different. So you may have the conservative bloc winning the European elections, but then at national level, the more progressive blocs can, shape governments. Also on the same day, there are cases in which national election and European Parliament elections were held on the same day, and you had maybe a conservative government and a progressive majority in the European Parliament, or vice versa.
Guillermo, we have been following in the past term of the European Parliament issues such as the Green Deal and tech regulations, which have obviously taken quite a major focus. How do you think these policy areas are likely to be impacted by the new Parliament?
This is one of the issues that I was mentioning at the beginning. So you have a numerical majority that is the same as last Parliament. So you are likely to expect that the Green Deal and similar policies maybe that will be strengthened or carried forward and not revised. I would say that given that how quickly evolving is the international geopolitical landscape, it would be very wise from the majority that came out of the election to listen to many of the instances being brought forward by the more right-wing parties. It would be very wise, because otherwise the divide between Brussels bubble and the people will likely increase. And that's not going to be a very good result either for the EU institution and for the European citizens. So I'm expecting that although we'll continue some sort of progressiveness, let's use this term, in many policies, especially on climate, on transportation, there will be a less ideological approach and more cautious approach on this stuff. It's pretty clear that when you have 95% of rare earths or critical materials for supply chains and for electric vehicles basically being held of China, you cannot go forward in killing your traditional automobile industry, and going towards EVs and being a hostage of China. That doesn't make really sense. So I'm expecting, some news there. And also on climate approach will be more practical and less ideological. So I think the next parliament will be a less ideological parliament in terms of any sort of areas that they will cover, going from foreign policy to common defense projects to green. Also on migration, I would say that there's going to be lots of attention on the protection of external borders and less a rhetoric of come to the EU, there is place for everyone. When you have 12% unemployment and many millions of European citizens living on subsidies.
Guglielmo, you have an extensive array of experience in NATO and expertise in foreign policy. How do you see the new parliament impacting the EU's foreign policy, particularly on some of the geopolitical challenges with the ongoing war in Ukraine, as well as what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, this is a debate that's going, on and off the European Union in the last 20 years, and especially in the last 5, when the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared that Europe should have a strategic autonomy. The reality is that the EU has no common foreign policy, although there is a high representative of for foreign policy. It doesn't have any common defense. And the two major countries that actually, in theory, are asking for more foreign policy and more common foreign policy and the role for the EU on the global level, at geopolitical level, are then those who always send their foreign minister or defense minister at any table, and they don't accept any sort of limitation of their sovereignty. And these two countries are two not negligible countries, which are France and Germany. So unless there is a shift on their view of the world and of the European Union, it's unlikely that Europe will play a political role both at foreign policy level or at the defense. On the defense level, there is the call for establishing, a European common defense strategy to have an army. It has, first of all, to be clarified how the EU defense policy interacts with NATO. We have to, to write down the priority of use of single troops. To give a stupid example, you have an infantry brigade you can use for domestic issues. That brigade might be available for NATO and might be available for the EU. So what is the mechanism that regulates that? There is a mechanism already in place between the NATO use and the domestic use, but there is no use for, So you cannot use the same brigade for 3 times. So what is the chain of command? What is the priority? This has to be clarified. And so far, I've heard many words, but no facts on clarifying the priority. So how NATO has less priority to the EU defense policy. Also, there is an industrial approach to it. France and Germany, they want the European defense simply because their approach is we build a European program, so instead of financing our national programs with taxpayer money from France and Germany, we do at the cost of all the EU member states, but we finance our industries. So basically, the backbone of the European defense should be a Franco-German axis, the industrial power. And of course, that is not viable for a country like Italy, but Spain itself, for Poland, for many other manufacturing powerhouses that are smaller, but they rely a lot on manufacturing heavy equipment. It might be the Slovaks, the Czechs, the Hungary, or even a smaller country. Few people know that Greece is one of the most important one in producing steel, because the Germans don't have enough capacity, so they have to go either to, if they want to stay inside the market, the European Union, they go likely to Greece, because they have good welders who can do real stuff with steel, or they have to go to Turkey or to outside EU countries. So the real question is what France and Germany are ready to do, and that's the answer to the strategic autonomy or an increased role for the European Union, both at the political, foreign policy, and defense level. Otherwise, we are the biggest and largest trading bloc in the world. We are very good at it. I would keep in doing what we are doing it well, like trading, and try to be less adventurous or ambitious in fields that neither France or Germany really wants to explore, being foreign policy and defense.
Guglielmo, thank you very much for your time. You've done an excellent job of unpacking and putting simply many issues there. It's not easy to talk about the EU in such a short space of time, given all of its complexities and layers, but you've done really well for us, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was my most pleasure, and I hope people understand a little bit more of the very complicated landscape of the EU.
And that's been this week's episode of Put Simply. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Oroka Group to stay up to date with all the latest episodes and news. Feel free to leave a comment and suggestions on what you'd like to see featured on the podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrahim.
Thanks for listening.